Hello again and welcome to another Mordian Glory video. Today's video is going to be controversial, to say the least. It's a spicy meatball. I'm going to share with you my theory, my crackpot idea that Warhammer the Old World is going to be the biggest game that GW makes. It's going to be Age of Sigmar, it's going to be Lord of the Rings, and it might even have a chance to unseat the king, Warhammer 40k. I'm just gonna say it, Old World is gonna beat Warhammer 40k. A bold statement indeed, and I know what your gut instinct is going to be. You're thinking, Mordian, you're an idiot, you're a cur, you're a cad, you're a whoresome knave, you finally lost it. 40k is this giant goblin that sits on top of the whole GW brand, nay, the whole miniatures ecosystem. It's too big to be beaten. But wait a second, before you completely dismiss me and click off this video, give me a moment of your time, because this isn't some clickbait, half-baked, harebrained, off-the-cuff video. I've actually given this a lot of thought, and I've given it a lot of consideration. And I want to take you through, step by step, my theory, my argument for why I think Old World could be the new king. And the more I talk, maybe, just maybe, more sense all of this is going to make. Let's begin with a brief autopsy. Let's look at what killed Warhammer Fantasy. Because surely if the game's died once already, just rebooting it, inevitably it's going to demise again, right? Well, looking back at old comments, videos, and even some of the more recent posts, there are generally believed to be three core causes, three main reasons why Warhammer Fantasy died. The first reason, and in my opinion, the biggest cause of its downfall, was the total lack of communication and support from Games Workshop. Back in the day, you would get your army book, and that would be it. There was no FAQs, there were no updates, no balanced data slates, no points changes. You got your book and you were happy with it, and that book was going to last you for at least the edition. And it was no guarantee that you would get a new book every single edition. You have factions like the Bretonnians who went multiple editions with no update. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bretonnian bros, let me know, fellow Knights of the Realm, but I believe Bretonnians had the same army book from 5th, 6th edition fantasy all the way through till the end times. No update. Almost a decade with just the same rules with almost no updates whatsoever. Now, in an ideal world where all army books are balanced, then this isn't a problem, because it doesn't matter if your army book is a little old and you've had to use it for a while. If it still works, then it's not an issue. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But what happens when it is broke and it needed fixing? Well, this is Games Workshop, so there are balance issues in their games. This is not something that's unique to Warhammer 40k. And so the problem that Fantasy had is you had some army books that came out and they were unusably bad. For example, Beastmen. And then you had other armies that were so utterly gigafucked, so overtuned, that they were unbeatable in an equal matchup. To put this into perspective for my fellow 40k players, go back to the beginning of 10th edition when it was first released and remember how broken Eldar were. I mean, they're still really powerful. At the time of recording, they've received 4 waves of nerfs and they're widely considered to still be the best faction at the beginning of 10th. But, you know, we'll just go back to the beginning when they were untouched, unsullied by the nerf hammer. They were so broken and powerful that tournaments were banning them before they had even seen the full index. They were so broken that people were saying that 10th edition was going to die if they weren't fixed. And some people said that 10th edition was dead within a month because of how overtuned the Eldar were. Now imagine that situation where they're completely unnerfed and they never get fixed. No nerfs, no balance patches, no FAQs. They just stay in that state for 3 to 4 years for the whole edition. You can imagine what that would do for the health of the game. But that's what Warhammer Fantasy had to live through. And there were some attempts by the tournament scene to correct this. You had the Swedish comp system, where overpowered codexes would go to tournaments with 1500 point lists, and underpowered army books would go to tournaments with 2500 point army lists. So there were literally 1,000 points difference between the armies to try and balance them out. It wasn't perfect, it didn't really work. The overpowered armies were still overpowered. But that's all well and good for tournaments, but the average gaming group just didn't have any of that. And most people didn't want to play with a homebrew rule set, so you just had people who got sick of being beaten week in, week out by their local Skaven player, and so they just left. They went with the game system. They primarily went to things like Warhammer 40k. But the second reason why Warhammer Fantasy is often said to have died is the large army sizes required. 8th edition and the End Times were very horde focused, lots of blocks of infantry moving around the place. There were many factions that were elite and more monster mash, but even those, by necessity, often had a big block of 40 plus infantry just in the middle of their formation. And those models would take a lot of time and money to build and paint. And that takes a lot of emotional investment as well when you're having to build a large army. And if the game is unbalanced, then it kind of feeds back to the first point. If you have to buy a lot of models and spend a lot of money and spend a lot of time, you're not going to be incentivized to do that if you feel like it's just a waste of time and a waste of money because you're building a unit that's not going to be very effective on the tabletop. And the third and final reason often credited with Fantasy's death was it was just too niche. Warhammer 40k is pretty accessible because it leans on so many different sci-fi aspects. You want to embrace Starship Troopers, you can get the Guard. You like the Alien movies, you can collect Tyranids. You like Terminator, you can collect the Necrons. There's all sorts of things that can attract you into the game. When it came to fantasy, at the time, sort of the biggest fantasy icon was Lord of the Rings. And if you were going to get into a tabletop fantasy game and you liked Lord of the Rings, you weren't going to go into GW, walk past the Uruk-hai and then go to the fantasy orcs and goblins. No. You want to play tabletop Lord of the Rings, you're going to play tabletop Lord of the Rings. So fantasy was its kind of own isolated bubble, its own world. And generally speaking, in mainstream appeal and media, fantasy wasn't in the ascendancy. Sci-fi was. So if that explains why fantasy died, the next important question is, what's changed? The first thing is that GW is now a lot more interactive with their community and their game systems. Before 8th edition 40k, as far as I'm aware, there was no Warhammer community website. You didn't know what was coming. There was no hype train. You didn't know if something was going to get balanced or when a new army was going to come out because it just didn't exist. There was no communication. The only time you knew when an army was going to be updated was when you went into your Games Workshop that weekend and there was a new army book on the shelf. That was it. There was no prior warning. But now the community is plugged in. People can see what's coming. GW has a release cycle and roadmaps, and they keep the customer informed. And when there are balance issues, GW will say, look, we're going to release our balanced data slate, and that's going to be in September. But speaking of FAQs and balanced data slates, that is the biggest change between then and now. It's not a perfect system, but you know with a degree of certainty that if something is broken in the game right now, that Games Workshop is going to take steps to fix it. They might not get it right first time, and it might take multiple swings from the nerf bat, but they are going to take steps to rein in the biggest offenders. I know many of us, including myself, have complained in the past about the game changing too frequently. You buy your models, by the time you've built and painted them, the rules have changed. But as someone who has done some serious retrospection and serious thinking about how it was before and how it is now in preparation for this video as part of the research, I can tell you that whilst it might feel like you're on a treadmill constantly with 40k these days, it feels like you can never quite get your army to the meta and as efficient as you want it to be, I would rather have that system than have what we had in the past. Because what we had in the past killed Warhammer Fantasy, one of my most beloved childhood games, and I'm confident that if it had 40k treadmill, if it had that system, it wouldn't have died. Now, this game balance leads me on to my second point, which was the large army problem. I think there's three things that are going to make this less of an issue for fantasy. Firstly, if there is a mechanism for balance, people are more likely to spend the money and buy the units. They're not going to worry so much if Unit A is overpowered or Unit B is underpowered, if they know, well, it's going to get fixed at some point anyway. I might as well just buy the units that I like, and then by the time I built and painted them, they probably will have been changed, and now this unit will be cool, it'll be good. Or I can use it without feeling like I'm using something overpowered. People can spend their money and not worry about it. On top of this, and this might be my own perspective, and I totally understand and respect that everyone's financial situation is different, but I feel like as a whole, the Warhammer community has got used to the idea of large collections, of large armies of models. In the past, you used to get your army, and because it never really changed, you'd get up to like sort of 2,000 or 3,000 points worth of models, and that would kind of be it. And then maybe you'd move on to another army if you wanted to, or maybe you'd kind of leave it. Now, Warhammer 40k, with the constant changes and stuff, people are just used to buying this unit because it's a bit more up to date, or people are just used to having bigger army sizes because maybe they see it online. You've got a lot of people, YouTubers, content creators, who show off their vast collections of 40k, and people see that stuff and they're inspired. They're like, wow, look at that giant Tyranid swarm army, I'd love a giant Tyranid swarm army. Or whoa, look at that Space Marine demi company, I'd love to try that out. Or whoa, look at that Imperial Guard tank company. Sure, you don't need 12 Lehman Russes. I know there's a lot of angry Guard players disagreeing with me in the comments right now, but you're more likely, I feel these days, to come across someone with a pure tank army because 40k has become the main hobby for a lot of people. I get that these initial points I've made are a little intangible. It's hard to say whether someone now is more willing to spend money than someone in the past, and who knows, balance, it matters to certain people more than others. Some people don't care, they just want to buy models because they think they're cool. Let's go for a hard factor. There are a lot of alternative sources of models. In the past, you had to get them from Games Workshop or a third-party seller selling Games Workshop, but either way, you were still spending a lot of money. Now, with the advent of multiple hundreds of third-party model sellers and 3D printing, you can get large quantities of models for much cheaper. And don't forget, painting those large armies has never been easier. With the popularity of airbrushes and the fact that contrast paint allows people to get their armies up to a battle-ready standard in next to no time, no longer do you have either the financial or the time investment that you did before. But moving on to our third and final point again, Games Workshop is no longer niche. Warhammer is mainstream. There are so many social media and YouTube channels dedicated solely to talking about Warhammer 40k, full time. When South Park makes an episode about you, you know you've made it. On top of this, you've got the rise of TV shows like The Witcher, and Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, which are again making people get excited for swords and sorcery. But the big one is Warhammer Total War. Warhammer Total War is the most successful Total War game that's been made. In fact, Warhammer Total War has been so successful that, and this is a controversial take, feel free to respectfully but passionately disagree with me down in the comment section below, it's killed historical Total War. Total War Pharaoh completely flopped on launch, and by doing so it has created a bit of a schism in the community and a bit of an identity crisis for the Total War series. You have the OG die-hard core fans that are saying, we're sick of this fantasy stuff, we want more historical. And then you have what I would argue is now the larger, newer fan base that says, I don't care about the historical stuff, I want more Warhammer Total War, make more of that. And it's going to be interesting to see where Creative Assembly goes. Do they look after the fans that got them to where they are, or do they look to the future and lean on what is essentially a guaranteed moneymaker, Warhammer Total War? This isn't a Total War video, and I am not qualified to really give an in-depth opinion on that at all. It's very much a high-level summary of what's happening. But the reason I'm mentioning this at all is Warhammer Total War has created a huge awareness of the old world, and more than likely it will be the future of the franchise. And so even more so than you have now, you are going to have a huge group of people who are going to play the video game and are going to get curious about where this video game came from. They're going to understand that it's based on some tabletop game, and then they're going to want to try it out. And then you have to understand that these people that will be coming from video games to tabletop are likely to be quite, I would say maybe competitive, methodically minded. If you're playing a video game, you want to play it to the best of your ability, or you want to build that like cool niche army. Sometimes you've got Total War players that like to build like doom stacks, and sometimes you've got those people that want to run those funny quirky armies like, I'm going to complete the game by only using goblins. Those kinds of people with that kind of mentality fits perfectly in with tabletop 40k, because they're going to come from the Total War video game. They're going to see their favorite faction where they'll be able to actually touch and interact with the models, and they are going to get hooked. And all the competitive players are going to come over and from playing video games competitively, and they're going to apply that same mindset to the tabletop. And this leads me on to the next point, the big one. You see, up until now, we've talked about what killed fantasy and what's changed. And you might be convinced now, you might be thinking, okay, Mordian, I think that fantasy is going to launch, it's going to be okay, and it'll be like a second or third game to 40k, okay? But there's one thing you've not taken into account, one thing that would make fantasy potentially the Kingslayer, potentially the next top dog, and that is tournaments. Like them or not, it is pretty difficult to deny that 40k is now led by the competitive scene. It is the thing that influences all aspects of the game. Even if you are a casual player, you're probably playing narrative. Even if you just play with friends, you will be aware of balanced data slates and patches. Whether you use the Warhammer app, Warapedia or Battlescribe or any other number of things to build your lists, those apps are going to update their points values and their rules based on the updates that come out from Games Workshop, the balance patches, the FAQs. Even people who don't go to tournaments keep an eye on the balance of the game. They'll talk about what is broken and what needs nerfing. They'll talk about what is underpowered and what is good and what is bad. And tournaments and events are bigger than they've ever been before and are more popular. You have thousands of players traveling internationally to go to things like LVO, LGT, Nova, Adepticon, and even on a more local scale, there are tournaments everywhere, especially in the UK. Myself alone, I can travel in any direction for an hour or less, at most an hour, And any town I go to, there'll be a game store hosting an event every weekend. Every weekend I can go to a tournament if I want to. They are absolutely everywhere and they're always well attended, and people are having a lot of fun playing at events right now. It's almost undeniable that competitive 40k is absolutely the focus and the driving force of the game right now. But what does any of this have to do with Old World? Well, I've spoken to a few tournament organizers, and they've said one of the biggest issues with running a 40k tournament these days is the amount of terrain, the expectation when it comes to the event. Even relatively local GTs, something that might run once a year and is run by one dude, they are expected to have UKTC, WTC, hell, even GW in the 10th edition guide has said, these are the terrain maps that we recommend you play on. These are the missions that we recommend you put together. These are the twists and the deployments. This is what we think you should use. And it showcases an incredibly dense amount of terrain. I spoke to one TO who said he started running events about 3 years ago. He has spent thousands of pounds on UKTC terrain. He's only just now, 3 years later, and half a dozen tournaments later, he's only now starting to break even on that initial terrain investment. It is ridiculously expensive. It's a big barrier for people to set up their own tournaments. And you might say, oh, well, you don't have to use tournament terrain. And that is true. But a lot of events are judged very harshly if they don't have good terrain. You might get people to turn up to your first one, but you might try and run another tournament with this more narrative terrain, and people just won't come along because there is a certain expectation which is given. I'm going to a tournament, I expect things to be run on BCP, I expect certain timings on rounds, I expect there to be a certain quality and style of terrain. These are just the norms that are wanted by the player base right now. But Old World has none of that. There is next to no terrain on a Warhammer Fantasy table. At most, you might have 4 or 5 bits. A couple of forests to anchor a flank, a couple of hills, some elevated firing positions. That's it. You wouldn't even need to have immersive terrain. If there's one thing that L-shaped ruins has taught us about the Warhammer community, they are very, very accepting of quite shitty terrain if it helps with balance. You could have a rectangular cutout that just says hill on it, and you know if one of your units is on top, it's on an elevated firing position, it can shoot over its friends. You could have a green circle, just flat, which says forest on it, and the players would know, oh, that's the forest, so I know I can't like move or march through that. You could have a battle mat with 4 little mats or markers on it to represent the terrain. That would be it. It would be nothing. A TO could print them out on paper, blue tack them onto the battle map that they didn't move. It would be such a low overhead, such a low cost, which would maximize the amount of profit that they could make and would immediately reduce the barrier to entry for anyone setting up their own event. If tournaments and competitive play are the main driving force behind a successful Games Workshop game, then reducing that barrier to entry will make it much easier for TOs to get involved, and that will create more drive. If you ask any tournament organizer right now if they could run a legitimate 40k tournament and not need to have all that terrain and spend all that money, they would bite your hand off at the opportunity. And I would bet that any TO worth his salt is closely watching Old World with interest. Because if there's even a whiff that it's going to take off and be successful, and if there's even a slight hint that there is appetite for a tournament scene for it, then they're going to want to jump on that, because it will be the cheapest, most cost-effective way to run a competitive Warhammer event. So in summary, what killed Warhammer Fantasy in the past, the lack of support, the cost, and how niche it was, are no longer factors. We have FAQs, cheap alternative models, and quick ways of painting them, and it's much more mainstream. And on top of all of this, tournament play is incredibly prevalent right now, and Old World has a really, really accessible tournament scene. So in summary, the things that killed Old World are gone. They have been fixed, and the competitive scene has never been more popular. It is the driving force, and Old World will make it ridiculously easy for TOs to organize events. This will give Old World a huge amount of potential momentum, and most importantly, they'll be very cheap to run, making them extremely profitable for TOs. And that is why I think Old World has the potential to become the biggest game and the potential to unseat Warhammer 40k from its throne. But of course, all of this is just like my opinion, man. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Do you agree that Old World might just do it? Or do you think that Warhammer 40k is just too big to be beaten? If you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to smash that like button. And of course, subscribe to never miss an episode. Would you like to know more? If so, then please consider becoming a channel member or patron. By supporting the channel, not only will you be doing your part, but you'll also be helping me create more content for your viewing pleasure and unlocking a whole host of perks. You get everything from a badge next to your name, custom emojis, but the big one is access to the Mordian Glory Discord server, an online community with almost 2,500 active members. It's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got channels for army lists, hobbying, tactics, stories, and even a pretty spicy meme section as well. For all you greenhorns that wanted to see the Mordian glory hole, today is your lucky day. And joking aside, I do want to say a massive thank you to all of the current channel members and patrons. You guys are amazing. Truly the lifeblood of the channel. I could not do Mordian Glory full-time without the incredible and generous support of my members. So thank you guys so much. And last but certainly not least, I want to say a personal thank you to all of my top tier Patreons. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the Call of Duty. So a massive thank you to Bon Vert, Mad Larkin, Mark Panconi, RJ Scorpion, Swordfish Trombone, John Stubbs, Nick Walsh, Diesel Fox, August Vardy, and the Tommies. Thank you guys. Your incredible support makes a huge difference, and it is a big part of how I'm able to do Mordian Glory full time. But that's all for now. Thank you for watching, and of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.